Daniel Miller never expected his life to change after college. He had just turned 22 and moved back to his father's home in Seattle while trying to figure out his next steps. His friends were moving out, starting jobs, building futures, but Daniel felt lost. The house that once felt alive now seemed quiet and cold. His father, Mark, was away most of the time for business trips. And that left Daniel living with his new stepmother, Claire. Claire wasn't the kind of woman who filled a room with noise or attention. She was gentle, soft-spoken, and carried an elegance that didn't need to be shown. She had been married to Daniel's father for just 2 years, and though Daniel respected her, they never really got close. She always treated him kindly, made breakfast when he woke up late, asked if he was eating well, and smiled politely when he answered with short replies. One quiet afternoon, as the rain tapped gently against the windows, Daniel was sitting at his desk scrolling through job listings when he heard a knock on his door. It was light, hesitant, not his father's firm kind of knock. Daniel. Claire's voice came from the other side. "Yeah. Come in," he said, setting his phone down. She opened the door slowly and peeked in. Her brown hair tied loosely, a cardigan hanging around her shoulders. "Hey," she said softly. "Do you have a minute?" "Sure," he replied. "Everything okay?" She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I just wanted to ask you something." Daniel turned his chair toward her. "What's up?" She stepped into the room and stood near the window, as if gathering courage. "It's been quiet lately, hasn't it? Ever since your dad left for that overseas project?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, it has." She looked out at the rain, her fingers brushing the curtain. "I guess I didn't realize how big this house feels when you're alone in it." Then she turned toward him, her expression soft but uncertain. "So I was wondering if maybe we could have dinner together tonight. Just you and me, like family." Daniel blinked, a little surprised. "Dinner?" She nodded quickly, almost embarrassed. "Yes, nothing fancy. I'll cook something simple. I just thought it might be nice. You don't have to, of course, but I'd like that." Daniel interrupted gently. She looked at him then, really looked, and her eyes brightened a little. "You would?" "Of course," he said with a small smile. "It's been kind of lonely for me, too." Something eased in her face. "Good," she said softly. "I'll make roast chicken. You used to like that, didn't you?" Daniel frowned slightly. "You remember that?" "I remember a lot," she said with a quiet laugh. 7 o'clock then?" He nodded. "I'll be there." As she left the room, Daniel leaned back in his chair, thinking about her words. Dinner together. Just the two of them. He didn't see any harm in it, but there was something in her tone, a kind of sadness, that made him want to be there for her. He didn't know her well, but she seemed lonely, maybe even lost in her own home. When evening came, Daniel walked downstairs, drawn by the smell of roasted herbs and butter. The dining table was set neatly, candles flickering, soft jazz playing in the background. Claire stood in the kitchen, placing the last dish on the counter. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. "Wow," he said, smiling. "You really went all out." She laughed quietly. "I got carried away. It felt nice to cook for someone again." He helped her bring the dishes to the table. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, vegetables. Simple but perfect. When they sat down, Claire poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and lifted hers slightly. 2 family dinners, she said, smiling. Daniel raised his glass. 2 family dinners. They ate and talked at first about small things. Movies, weather, his college friends. But soon the conversation drifted deeper. She asked about his plans, his dreams, his fears about the future. Daniel, who rarely opened up, found himself talking freely. Maybe it was the warmth of the room or the way she listened so sincerely. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice. She just listened, with that quiet understanding that made people feel safe. At one point, he asked about his father, how she felt being alone so often. Claire hesitated before answering. "It's hard," she admitted. "Your dad means well, but sometimes I feel like I married a man who loves his work more than his life." She gave a soft, self-conscious smile. "But I'm learning to be okay with it." Daniel nodded. "I get that. He's always been like that, focused. Sometimes too much. She met his eyes for a moment, and he saw something behind her, calm, a flicker of emotion, maybe sadness, maybe longing. But she quickly looked down and said, "Anyway, enough about me. How about dessert?" She brought out a small homemade pie, still warm. They shared it, laughing when Daniel burned his tongue on the first bite. It felt natural, easy, like two people rediscovering warmth in a cold house. When the clock struck 10, Claire began clearing the table, but Daniel stopped her. "Let me," he said. "You cooked? I'll clean." She smiled, touched. "Thank you, Daniel." As he washed the dishes, she stood nearby, drying them. Their conversation slowed, the silence between them no longer awkward but peaceful. She glanced at him once, noticing how much he resembled his father. The same strong jaw, but gentler eyes. He, in turn, noticed how graceful she looked under the soft kitchen light. How kind her voice sounded when she thanked him again. When everything was done, they stood for a moment, unsure what to say. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "I'm glad you said yes tonight," she said. "Me too," Daniel replied. "It was nice. You make the house feel like home again." Her eyes softened. "That's the nicest thing anyone's said to me in a long time." They smiled, both feeling something they couldn't name. Not love, not attraction, but connection. Two lonely souls sharing warmth in a house that had felt empty for too long, as Daniel headed to his room. Claire stood by the dining table, blowing out the candles one by one. She paused before the last one, watching the small flame dance. Something inside her felt lighter, like she had found a small piece of life again, upstairs. Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He could still hear her laugh, see the way her eyes glowed when she spoke about art. And he realized how little he actually knew about her, this woman who had quietly carried so much pain and grace. He didn't know what the next days would bring. But something told him that dinner was just the beginning. Because when Claire had asked him to have dinner like family, what she really asked for was connection. And in giving her that, Daniel unknowingly opened a door to something far deeper than either of them expected. The rain outside fell softly through the night. And in that quiet house, two hearts began to heal, slowly, gently, without even realizing it. The next evening, the house smelled like comfort, a mix of herbs, roasted chicken, and something sweet baking in the oven. Daniel had gone for a long walk earlier to clear his head. But no matter how far he went, he couldn't stop thinking about last night's dinner. It had felt different, warm but quiet, gentle but charged with emotions he didn't fully understand when he stepped inside. He heard soft music coming from the kitchen. Claire was already there, wearing a light blue dress, her hair tied loosely in a bun. She turned when she heard his footsteps, smiling in that calm, familiar way. "You're early," she said, surprised. "I didn't want to miss out on that smell," he replied, smiling back. She laughed quietly. "Well, you'll be my official taste tester then." They moved easily around each other, like they'd done this for years. Daniel set the table while Claire finished cooking. The little details, the way she folded napkins, the small candle she lit in the middle of the table, made everything feel personal. Not formal, not forced. Just human. Dinner was simple, yet everything about it felt meaningful. They talked more this time about her life before she met his father, about her old job as an art teacher, and the small apartment she used to have in Portland. Daniel listened, fascinated by the parts of her story he had never heard before. "You used to teach?" he asked. "For almost 10 years, she said, pouring him a glass of water. "I stopped when your dad and I got married. I thought it was time to slow down, but sometimes I miss it." "You should paint again," Daniel said without thinking. Claire looked at him, surprised. "You really think so?" He nodded. "Yeah. You talk about it like it still makes you happy." She smiled softly, and for a moment, the sadness in her face faded. "Maybe I will." As they ate, Claire shared old memories of Daniel's father, how they met at a small art exhibit, how he'd tried to impress her by pretending to know about paintings. Daniel laughed, shaking his head. That sounds exactly like him. Claire laughed too, the sound light and genuine. He was so serious back then. I thought he was judging every piece of art, but later he admitted he just didn't understand any of it. Their laughter filled the kitchen. For the first time in a long while. The house didn't feel empty. After dinner, they stayed at the table, drinking tea and talking about little things, the weather, her garden, the neighbors who never stopped arguing over parking. Time passed without either of them noticing. When Daniel looked at the clock, it was already past 9. "You should have told me it's late," Claire said, standing up. "I didn't mind," Daniel replied. "It was nice talking." She hesitated, then said softly, "It's been a while since I laughed like this." "Thank you, Daniel." Her words caught him off guard. He smiled awkwardly. "You don't have to thank me." "I do," she said, her voice warm. "I think I forgot what it felt like to be seen? To talk to someone who actually listens." There was something raw in her tone, not romantic, but emotional, honest. Daniel didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, understanding her in silence. The moment stretched longer than either of them meant it to. Finally, she took the empty plates to the sink, breaking the quiet with the sound of running water. Daniel stood up to help her. "Let me," he said, taking the plate from her hands. Their fingers brushed for a second, just a touch, but it made them both pause. Claire quickly pulled back, smiling a little too fast. "You really don't have to." "I want to," Daniel said gently, so they washed dishes together. She dried them while he rinsed, their movements slow and natural. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. The soft music from earlier still played in the background, and the air felt warm. Almost alive. After they finished, Claire leaned against the counter and looked at him thoughtfully. "You've grown up a lot, Daniel. I still remember when you barely spoke to me after the wedding." He laughed. "Yeah, I wasn't great at accepting change back then." She nodded. "Change is hard. I still struggle with it too." For a moment, they just looked at each other, two people from different worlds brought together by circumstance, both quietly missing the same man in different ways. Then Claire said softly, "Your dad would be proud of you. You know that, right?" Daniel frowned. "I don't know. I haven't really done anything yet." She shook her head. "You have. You've been kind, patient. You stayed here instead of running away from home like most kids your age. That says something." Her words hit deeper than he expected. For months, Daniel had felt invisible to his father, to himself. But in that moment, hearing those simple words from her made something inside him shift. "Thanks," he said quietly. She smiled, her eyes soft. "You don't need to thank me either." They both laughed, easing the weight in the air. Later, as Daniel walked her to the door of her room, Claire turned to him and said, "I know this might sound strange, but tonight reminded me of my old life before everything got complicated. I almost forgot how good it feels to just talk." "I'm glad," Daniel said sincerely. "We can do this again sometime." She nodded, a small spark of hope lighting in her eyes. "I'd like that." He said goodnight, and as he walked to his room, he realized something had changed. The distance that once existed between them was gone. They weren't strangers anymore, but as he lay in bed, replaying the night in his head, he also felt a strange pull in his chest. Not attraction, not confusion, but something gentle and unfamiliar. Maybe it was connection. Maybe it was simply the comfort of being seen and heard after feeling invisible for so long. In her room, Claire sat on the edge of her bed looking at the half-finished painting by the window. It had been sitting there for months, untouched, half forgotten. But now, after Daniel's words, she picked up the brush and touched the canvas again. Her hand trembled slightly, but she smiled. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to paint again, as she added a stroke of color to the blank sky. She felt something lift from her shoulders, the weight of silence, of loneliness. She didn't know where this new closeness with Daniel would lead. But for the first time in a long while, she felt alive, down the hall. Daniel couldn't sleep. The sound of rain tapping softly against the window matched the rhythm of his thoughts. He wasn't sure what exactly had changed, but he knew something had begun, something delicate, fragile, and real. That dinner had not just filled the empty house with laughter again. It had opened a quiet door between two lonely hearts, one that neither of them had meant to unlock. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, both knew the truth. They had found something rare understanding. It wasn't love yet, not even close, but it was something powerful enough to make them feel less alone in a world that had grown too. Quiet days passed quietly after that dinner. The air in the house felt lighter, and Daniel found himself looking forward to small things. The smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of Claire's soft humming from the kitchen, the warmth of her simple good morning. It wasn't just politeness anymore. It felt like connection. For the first time since moving back, the house felt like home. One afternoon, Daniel came downstairs to find Claire in the sunroom. The golden light poured through the wide windows, touching everything with a soft glow. She was standing in front of an easel, staring at a half-finished painting. The canvas showed a beautiful field under a glowing sky, but the edges were unfinished, like she had stopped halfway and never returned. He knocked gently on the doorframe. "Didn't know you still painted," he said. She turned, startled, then smiled. "I haven't in a long time," she admitted. "I used to paint every week, but I stopped after your dad's last trip. It just didn't feel right anymore." Daniel walked closer, studying the painting. The colors were warm and full of life, yet something about it felt lonely. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. Claire gave a faint laugh. "It doesn't feel finished." "I guess neither am I." Her words hung in the air, fragile but honest. Then she looked at him, her voice soft but hopeful. "Actually, Daniel, can I ask you to do something with me?" He smiled, recognizing the phrase. "Depends on what it is this time." She gestured toward the easel. "I want to finish this painting, but I can't seem to find the heart to do it alone. Would you stay with me? Just while I paint. I think it would help." "Course," he said without hesitation. "I'll help however I can." She handed him a stool and a small jar of brushes. "You can help me mix colors," she said, her tone lighter now. "It's not difficult. Just follow my lead." And so that afternoon they began. The first few minutes were quiet, just the sound of soft music and brushes moving on canvas. Daniel mixed paints carefully as she instructed, adding a touch of white here, a hint of yellow there. He didn't know much about art, but watching her work was mesmerizing. Her movements were graceful, her eyes focused, her hands steady. After a while, Claire said, "You have a calm energy, Daniel. You make it easier to paint." He chuckled. "That's the first time anyone said that about me." She smiled without looking up. Maybe they never paid attention. They continued working. Sometimes they talked about life, about his uncertainty after college, about the places she wanted to visit someday. Other times they said nothing at all, but the silence felt warm, not empty, as the sun lowered. Painting the room in orange light, Claire stepped back and sighed. "I used to think this painting was about loss," she said. "But maybe it's about finding peace instead." Daniel nodded, admiring her work. "You're really talented." "Thank you," she said softly. I forgot what it felt like to hear that. The next day she invited him again, and the next. Painting together became their quiet ritual. Sometimes they worked in silence. Other times they laughed over little mistakes, like the time Daniel accidentally splattered blue paint on the floor, or when she dropped her brush and left a streak across the sky. "Happy accidents," she said, smiling. "That's what art is all about." He liked seeing her like this, alive, expressive, full of color. It was a side of her he'd never seen before, and he realized how much she had hidden behind her calm, composed face. On the fourth day, as they painted the final layer, Claire paused suddenly. She was staring at the canvas, brush frozen midair. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked. Her voice trembled slightly. "I just remembered the last time I painted with your father. We were laughing about how bad he was at it." She smiled faintly, but her eyes glistened. "He told me he'd learn one day. He never did." Daniel didn't know what to say. He stepped closer and said softly, "He'd be proud you finished it." She looked at him then, her expression gentle. "Maybe, but I think I needed to do this more for myself, to remember who I was before everything became about missing him." There was silence again, the kind that said everything words couldn't. Claire took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and said with a shaky laugh, "You must think I'm silly." Daniel shook his head. "Not at all. I think you're brave." Something shifted in her eyes then, not romance, not desire, but gratitude, deep and sincere. "Thank you, Daniel," she said softly, "for being here. I didn't realize how much I needed this. Or you." He smiled, feeling his chest tighten slightly. "Any time," he said. By the 5th day, the painting was almost done. The golden fields stretched endlessly across the canvas, the sky glowing in soft orange and violet tones. When she painted, Claire looked younger, freer. Daniel found himself admiring her strength, the quiet kind that came from surviving grief and still finding beauty in life. "Almost done," she whispered. Adding a final touch of light near the horizon, Daniel stood beside her, watching the painting come to life. "It's perfect," he said. She smiled, shaking her head. "Not perfect, but it's mine." When she finally set the brush down, Claire exhaled deeply, as if she'd been holding her breath for months. "I can't believe I finished it." "You did," Daniel said, "and it's beautiful." She turned to him with tears in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you. You reminded me what it feels like to care again." He didn't answer, just smiled, because there were no right words for that moment. The evening light filled the room, soft and golden, wrapping them both in quiet peace. For a few minutes, neither spoke. They just stood there side by side, watching the painting, the symbol of something far greater than art. "Finally," Claire said, "you know, this painting started as a memory of your father, but now it feels like something new, like it belongs to both of us." Daniel met her eyes, his voice quiet. "Maybe it's a memory of healing." She nodded, a small tear rolling down her cheek. "Maybe it is." She turned away to clean her brushes, and Daniel helped her. The room smelled like paint and sunlight. Everything felt calm, yet something unspoken lingered in the air, a closeness that neither planned. But both felt that as he gathered the brushes, she said gently, "Daniel, you've given me something I didn't think I'd find again. Hope." He looked at her, uncertain how to respond. But before he could speak, she smiled and said, "That's enough for today. We'll hang it tomorrow." He nodded, though part of him didn't want the moment to end. That night, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about her, not in a romantic way, but in a way that made him realize how deeply human she was. Not just his stepmother, not just his father's wife, but a woman rediscovering herself after years of silence. And somewhere in that process, Daniel had rediscovered himself to Dot in her room. Claire sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the finished painting, now drying in the corner. She felt lighter than she had in years. There was still pain, but it no longer controlled her. She whispered to herself, "Thank you, Daniel," though he couldn't hear it. The house was quiet again, but not empty anymore. The painting they made together wasn't just art, it was a story of loss, healing, and two souls who, by simply sharing time and kindness, helped each other find life again. And though neither knew it yet, that painting would forever remind them of the days when two lonely hearts learned how to feel whole again. The next morning, sunlight poured softly through the windows of the sunroom, painting the floor with golden light. The painting that Daniel and Claire had finished stood proudly on the easel, complete, alive, and full of color. It looked different in the morning light, warmer somehow, like it carried the quiet strength of both their hearts. Daniel stood there for a long time, just looking at it. He thought about all the afternoons they had spent painting together, the laughter, the quiet moments, the way she smiled again after weeks of silence. It hadn't just been about art, it had been about healing. Claire walked into the room quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You're up early," she said, smiling. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "I wanted to see it again." She handed him a cup and stood beside him. "It looks different in daylight, doesn't it?" "Yeah," he said softly. "It looks alive." They both stared at the painting in silence for a while. The golden fields seemed to stretch endlessly, glowing under a painted sunset. It wasn't just a painting anymore. It was a memory. Claire sighed gently. "It's strange. I used to think finishing this would make me cry. But I don't feel like crying anymore. I feel peaceful." "That's a good thing," Daniel said. "It is," she agreed. "But it's also sad in its own way. Because when you move through grief, you realize how much you loved what you lost." Daniel nodded, understanding her words in a way he hadn't before. His father had been gone for months, yet in helping Claire, he'd felt closer to him than ever. Claire turned to him. "Daniel, can I tell you something?" "Of course. When I asked you to paint with me, it wasn't really about the painting," she said softly. "It was about trying to find life again. I didn't think I could feel anything anymore. But spending time with you reminded me that the world is still kind. That there's still warmth, still connection." Daniel didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell her that she'd done the same for him, that before all this, he'd felt lost and invisible. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he said simply, "You helped me too." She smiled, her eyes kind but filled with emotion. Maybe that's what healing really is, to people reminding each other that life isn't over yet. For a while, they just stood there, sipping coffee and watching the morning light shift across the canvas. Then Claire said softly, "I want to hang it in the living room. Your dad loved that space. I think he'd want it there." Daniel helped her lift the painting and hang it on the wall. When they stepped back to look at it, it felt like the room itself had changed. Brighter, warmer, filled with quiet hope. Claire whispered, "It feels right." "It does," Daniel agreed. They both smiled. But beneath that smile, something unspoken lingered. Something gentle and fragile. A shared understanding that what they had built together went beyond words. That afternoon, Claire asked Daniel to stay for lunch. They cooked together, laughing when the pasta boiled over. The simple joy of the moment made them both realize how far they had come from that first awkward dinner. There was ease now, and something like friendship, deeper than family, softer than love. After lunch, Claire sat by the window, watching the rain clouds gather again. Daniel joined her, sitting across the room. The silence between them felt calm, but full of meaning. Finally, she said, "Do you ever think about your father?" "Every day," he said. "But lately, it hurts less. Maybe because I feel like part of him is still here in you, in this house, in that painting." Her lips trembled slightly as she smiled. "He loved you more than he could ever say. I think he'd be proud of you." Daniel looked down, swallowing hard. "I hope so." "He would," she said firmly. "You have his strength, but your own kindness." Those words stayed with him. The way she said them wasn't casual. It was sincere, full of emotion. A soft breeze entered the room as the rain began to fall outside. Claire stood and looked at the painting once more. Then she turned to Daniel, her voice low but steady. "When I asked you to do this with me, to paint, to share time, I didn't realize how much it would change me. You brought something back I thought I'd lost forever." Daniel looked at her, listening. "I don't mean love," she continued, shaking her head gently. "Not the kind people talk about. I mean life. You made me remember what it feels like to be alive, to wake up with purpose, to laugh again, to see beauty." Her voice softened. "Thank you, Daniel, for helping me remember who I am." He wanted to tell her everything he felt, how much she'd inspired him, how her strength had given him direction. But he simply said, "You deserve to feel alive, Claire." She smiled, her eyes full of quiet affection. "So do you." They stood close now, the air between them still but heavy with understanding. For a second, neither spoke. Then Claire stepped back slightly and said, "We can't stay in this moment forever. You have your own life waiting. You should go chase it." Daniel nodded, though part of him didn't want to. "Yeah, I guess it's time I started figuring things out." "You will," she said. "You already are." He looked at her and smiled. "I'll miss this. The painting, the quiet mornings." "Me too," she whispered. But that's what makes it special, right? It doesn't last forever. A small silence followed, and then she said gently, "Your father would have wanted us to find peace. I think in some way we just did." The rain continued outside, tapping softly against the glass. Claire walked toward the doorway, then paused. "Daniel, if you ever feel lost again, remember what you helped me do here. You helped me heal. That means you can help yourself too." He nodded slowly, his chest tight but calm. "Thank you, Claire." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "No, Daniel. Thank you." As she left the room, Daniel turned back toward the painting. The colors glowed under the light, golden fields stretching toward an endless sky. He stared at it, realizing it told their story perfectly. Two broken people finding beauty again through pain, loss, and kindness. He whispered to himself, "We did this." Later that night, Daniel packed a small bag. He had decided to move out to take a job offer he'd been avoiding for weeks in Portland. It felt right. Before leaving, he walked through the house one last time. The quiet no longer felt empty. When he reached the sunroom, he stopped by the painting again. A note was taped to the frame, Claire's handwriting. It read, "Don't forget to live your own story. You helped me finish mine." Daniel smiled through the lump in his throat. He didn't cry, but he felt the weight of goodbye. As he drove away, the rain finally stopped. The sky opened up bright and golden like the one in their painting.